Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special edition of Bennett Place History from Home. We're here today on a very important date, April 26, 2020. Today marks the 155th anniversary of the third and final day of negotiations between General Johnston and General Sherman. This day will culminate in what will become the largest surrender of the American Civil War. The events surrounding this date are ones filled with tension. On April 18th, the generals were here and signed what we call the initial surrender term. This initial surrender term had just promptly been rejected in Washington by both the Congress and President Andrew Johnson. After this was rejected, Congress sends, being furious with Sherman, they send the only person that can tell Sherman what to do to Raleigh, and that's General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant goes to Raleigh with orders to take Sherman out of command, take over command of the negotiations, and to meet with Johnson and force him into surrendering. However, when Grant goes to Raleigh, he meets with Sherman. And Sherman and Grant being close friends since the early days of the war, Grant is not going to step on Sherman's toes by kicking him out of command. He knows that Sherman has a rapport with General Johnson after the previous 2 days of negotiations, and if anyone's going to get success out of this, it's going to be Johnston and not Grant, or Sherman and not Grant. Grant orders Sherman to telegraph Johnston, who's in Greensboro, and ask him to meet for a third time. Sherman telegraphs Johnston, and Johnston receives a telegraph saying, "Let's meet again. We have some things to figure out, the initial surrender term being rejected and all." At the same time, Johnson receives another telegraph from Jefferson Davis. Johnson knows Jefferson Davis is now in Charlotte. He had evacuated or gone to Charlotte and what's left of his cabinet to kind of escape the federal occupation or federal troops. Jefferson Davis, finding out of the initial surrender term being rejected, he wants Johnston's army in Charlotte. So he orders Johnston to disband the infantry and use the cavalry as an escort and go to Charlotte, where they would then rejoin and reconstitute the army in the field and fight somewhere out west or somewhere, it's kind of unclear where, for a continued resistance for the Southern Confederacy. Now, Johnson, having these two telegraphs and being a reasonable man and knowing the dire situation of his army and the end of this war, Johnson decides to disobey orders from his commander-in-chief, which is effectively treason. Instead, he telegraphs Sherman, and they agree to meet at the Bennett farm for one last time. On the morning of April 26, 1865, Sherman would again get on the train from Raleigh and go to Durham Station and hook up with his cavalry entourage and march west. Johnson would be in Hillsboro, hook up with his cavalry entourage, and march east. They would meet here at the Bennett farm, knowing James and Nancy. James and Nancy greet them and allow them to come in and use their parlor for another day of negotiations. And after a few hours of back and forth, Sherman and Johnston agree on the Appomattox Terms and adopting that for the armies here under Johnston's command. The Appomattox Terms being already had been approved by Congress, they know that again it will be approved here. There won't be any issues. See, the initial surrender term had two components. There was a military component and a civilian component. And that civilian component, which was non-military matters, that was what the problem was. So they knew they had to get rid of that and just delve in military matters. So they know the Appomattox Terms work, so they're going to try it here. The Appomattox Terms, again, will give paroles to all the Confederate soldiers. They will be allowed to keep their sidearms and their swords, because those most likely were private purchases anyways. And the soldiers would also be able to keep their horses, again, many of them at this point being privately owned. Now, as the generals leave, they know they finally come to an end of this war. It's coming to a close. Sherman will get on his horse and ride back to Durham Station and get on a train and go to Raleigh. He'll have the terms, he'll get them approved and signed by Grant. Grant signs them in Raleigh, and they get sent up to Washington and they are approved. Sherman will then almost immediately organize his army, at least the vast majority of it, in and around Raleigh, and they'll head north. They're trying to get to Washington, D.C. For the grand review that is in just a few weeks. Now, Johnson has a little bit more to deal with on his end. Johnson will get on his horse and ride west towards Hillsboro and ultimately Greensboro. And for the next few weeks, Johnston organizes his army into receiving paroles. He'll notify his division and regimental commanders, and it'll trickle down to the soldiers that the war's over, that they'll be receiving paroles, and they're told to go home. And this will take place over the next few days and few weeks. It takes a little bit of time for this to happen. But Johnston not only surrenders the Army of Tennessee here in North Carolina. That would, if he'd just done that, it would have been comparable to what Lee did at Appomattox, just his field command. Sherman and Johnston agreed to surrender everything under his command. And that included not only the troops here at Greensboro, North Carolina, but also South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And in those 4 states are 89,270 Confederate soldiers and sailors, and ultimately those 4 states as well. Again, the reason why it's the largest of the war. Johnston will organize an issue organize a way to print these paroles and issue them out to the men. The paroles, we have a copy of it right here. It's a simple document, but an important one. And each one of Johnston's men would have received one. It's a document that simply says who you are, where's home, I won't fight again, and it's signed by the appropriate authorities. This is an extremely important piece of paper. This would have given you free passage by federal transports and such to your home. Many of these soldiers having to go as far west as Texas. So this again identified you as a paroled soldier. Also in the years to come, soldiers had this fear that some of the things they might have done in the war would cause them to be arrested or be tried as a traitor. Again, that's what the many Confederates thought before the Appomattox Terms. They didn't know about these paroles. And this parole protected them and identified them as a paroled soldier. So it gave them protection and gave them passage to their homes, sometimes thousands of miles away. Very, very important piece of paper. But as Johnston is getting his men ready to go home and on their long journey, he decides to go a little bit further. In Greensboro, Johnston has several train cars, which is what's left of the Confederate Treasury. Early in April, as Richmond is falling, the Confederate Treasury, all the money the Confederacy has gathered throughout the wars, loaded on trains in Richmond, ends up in Danville, and then some of it ends up in Greensboro. Jefferson Davis was in Greensboro, but he left Greensboro and went to Charlotte. He expected that train cars and what's left of the Treasury to be loaded on wagons and follow him. However, that had not been done. Johnston had been left with a lot of Confederate paper currency, which was effectively useless, but what he did have was almost $40,000 in silver coins, and they're Mexican reals. This, again, it's silver, it's hard currency, it had value, and Johnston realized he had an opportunity to make his soldiers' life just that much easier on their ride home. He would order his subordinates to divide up that almost $40,000 the best they could to the troops that were in and around the city of Greensboro. And ultimately, all of those men would receive approximately $1.18 as their payment. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but with a Confederate soldier who has little to nothing, fought sometimes 40 long years of war, you have that parole to protect you and a little bit of hard currency. This made all the difference to many Confederate soldiers who had a long journey home. Now, Bennett Place's impact is one that's felt throughout the Confederacy in the upcoming weeks. The commanders out west, still holding smaller commands in Alabama, Mississippi, and out west in the Trans-Mississippi Department, are watching what's happening out here in the east. And when they hear of Lee's surrender on April 9th, even though Lee's the prominent commander, he's the head of the Confederate military at this point, the Army of Northern Virginia is the premier army of the Confederacy. Many thought that there was still a chance to fight. Yes, Lee's gone, but Johnston and his army is still in the field. It's a long shot, but he's still here. But after April 26th, the news spreads throughout the Western Confederacy that Lee and Johnston had surrendered. Johnston is surrendering so many men and such a large swath of what was left of the Confederacy. This surrender here between two generals in a small log cabin in the middle of nowhere, Orange County. This will signal the end of the American Civil War. The Confederate generals out west realize, wait, Lee and Johnson are gone? Yeah, there's no chance for us. And it's almost immediately you see these commanders. And first, Richard Taylor in Citronelle, Alabama. Later, Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi Department. And later Stan Wadey, who surrenders a brigade of Native American Confederate soldiers in what's now Oklahoma. The ball starts rolling much faster after Bennett Place. They realize this is the end. So as I like to say, Bennett Place here, it's big history in a small house.